The gavel slammed down, a sharp, echoing crack that sliced through the murmuring courtroom. Judge Edward Grayson, a man whose very presence seemed to suck the air out of the room, glared down from his elevated bench. His eyes, magnified by wire-rimmed glasses, landed on the late arrival, Karoline Leavitt. She wasn't just any late arrival. She was his next case. And tardiness, in Grayson's meticulously ordered world, was an unforgivable sin. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sent shivers down the spines of even the seasoned court reporters. Karoline, outwardly composed, felt a knot of anxiety tighten in her stomach. This was not how she'd envisioned her morning. The meticulously organized chaos of her life was usually reflected on her desk. Political documents, neatly stacked in her home office, her court attire, always prepared the night before. Karoline wasn't heading to the White House, where she typically wielded authority as President Donald Trump's spokesperson. No, today she needed to address a minor, personal matter at the Pinton Municipal Court. A contract dispute involving her family's used truck dealership. A misunderstanding, she believed, that could be easily cleared up. Before diving into the story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. Karoline had opted for a more casual outfit than her usual power suits. A neat, navy blue blazer over a crisp white blouse and black pants. Standing in front of her bathroom mirror, she carefully tied back her hair, the natural blonde locks she'd always taken pride in. At 27, her face radiated the steely determination forged from years working alongside Trump and self-studying law through campaign documents. Just a quick court appearance, she told herself, grabbing a banana and a thermal mug filled with fresh, strong coffee. Her BMW, a reward she'd given herself for contributing to Trump's election victory, waited patiently in the garage. The car was her pride and joy, though she sometimes noticed the surprised, almost disbelieving looks from strangers seeing a young woman step out of such an expensive vehicle. Morning traffic in Pinton moved at a snail's pace. Karoline wasn't worried. She'd left plenty of time to reach the courthouse. She turned on NPR, listening to the morning news, while mentally reviewing her paperwork for the contract dispute. The issue stemmed from a truck maintenance contract her family had signed with a local company. But the payment terms, clearly outlined in the agreement, conflicted with the actual invoice. She'd taken photos of the related documents, meticulous as always, to support her case. Suddenly, her car's Bluetooth system signaled an incoming call. The screen displayed the caller, Michael Reynolds, a senior political advisor at the White House. Karoline's heart leaped into her throat. A direct call from him always meant something urgent, something big. "Karoline, sorry for calling so early." Michael's voice came through the speakers, strained and tense. "We've got a major issue with the President's Gulf of America's decree. The press is going wild, absolutely wild, and I need you to review a response right away." Karoline gripped the steering wheel tighter, her knuckles turning white. The decree, renaming the Gulf of Mexico the Gulf of America, was one of Trump's most controversial policies, and she was its media point person, the one in the firing line. "Yes, of course. How long do I have to respond?" she asked, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the internal whirlwind. "Before noon today. I'm emailing you the documents now. Can you review them and call me back ASAP?" Michael's voice held a note of desperation. "Sure," Karoline replied, her tone professional, but her mind was already racing, calculating, strategizing. She'd planned to arrive at the courthouse early, to find the right courtroom, to settle in. But now she'd need to pull over somewhere, anywhere, to handle this. Karoline found a parking spot near a small, bustling coffee shop. She pulled out her laptop, connected to her phone's hotspot, and began reviewing the documents Michael had sent. The press questions were tough, relentless, requiring sharp, legally grounded responses to defend the decree. She took detailed notes, her pen flying across the page, determined to craft a perfect, airtight reply. Time slipped away, each minute a precious commodity. As she analyzed each point, each nuance, each potential pitfall. When she finally glanced at her watch, she jolted. It was nearly court time, and the courthouse was still a 10-minute drive away. Panic flared, hot and sharp. She quickly called Michael back, briefly discussed her initial thoughts, and promised a fuller, more polished response after her court appearance. Back in traffic, Karoline tried to stay calm, to breathe deeply. She'd never been late to a press briefing, a meeting, an event. It went against everything she stood for. But she also knew her role as White House press secretary didn't allow her to ignore critical duties. The Gulf of America issue could impact Trump's image, his standing with millions of his supporters, and that morning's response was pivotal in shaping public perception. Finally, she pulled into the Pinton Municipal Court parking lot, a precious few minutes, behind schedule. As she hurried toward the building, her phone buzzed with a thank you message from Michael Reynolds. "Your quick analysis was spot on. Thanks for prioritizing this, Karoline." Karoline allowed herself a small, tight smile. At least the delay had served an important purpose. But what she didn't realize, as she rushed up the courthouse steps, her paperwork clutched in her hand, was that arriving a few minutes late was about to spark a chain of events that would expose deep-seated biases in a system she'd never imagined confronting. Judge Edward Grayson's courtroom awaited her, and this ordinary morning was about to become anything but routine. Judge Edward Grayson's courtroom was known for its strict rules and cold efficiency. At 62, with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, he carried an air of authority, an almost palpable weight built over 30 years on the bench. That morning, he sat elevated above the room, his black robe pressed and pristine, watching people file into the courtroom with a hawk-like gaze. The municipal courtroom was already bustling, with over 20 individuals seated on the worn, wooden benches, most there for minor issues, traffic tickets, contract disputes, administrative matters. Grayson noted, with a flicker of approval, that most of the early arrivals were neatly dressed, their paperwork in order. He nodded approvingly at their punctuality, a virtue he held in the highest regard. "All rise," the bailiff, Robert Hayes, called out, his voice booming through the room as the session began. Judge Grayson launched into his familiar routine with practiced precision, handling the first few cases swiftly and efficiently, proud of running his courtroom like a well-oiled machine. To him, tardiness wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was a sign of disrespect, a blatant disregard for the law itself. When the courtroom door swung open a few minutes after the start, Karoline Leavitt slipped in quietly, trying her best not to disrupt the proceedings. But Judge Grayson, like a predator spotting its prey, halted mid-sentence in another case. His eyes narrowed as they fixed on the young woman who dared arrive late. "Step forward," he commanded, his voice sharp and icy, the very air in the courtroom seeming to freeze. The case in progress was abruptly set aside. Karoline approached the podium, her posture confident and professional. Despite the sudden, hostile reception, she could feel the eyes of everyone in the room on her, assessing, judging. Grayson glanced down at his schedule, a thin, cruel smile playing on his lips. "You must be Karoline Leavitt, scheduled for the start of this session," he said, emphasizing the timing with a tone dripping with disapproval. "Do you think your time is more valuable than the court's, Miss Leavitt?" Before she could even begin to respond, Grayson pressed on, his voice growing louder, more forceful with each sentence, intent on making an example of her. A few people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Earlier, a middle-aged businessman had arrived a few minutes late, and the judge had barely noticed. It was a subtle, yet telling discrepancy. "In this courtroom, we have rules," Grayson lectured, shuffling papers on his desk without even glancing at Karoline. "This isn't a White House press briefing or some media event where you can stroll in whenever you please. This is a court of law." Karoline stood still at the podium, her hands clasped in front of her, calmly observing. She noticed he hadn't even looked at her paperwork yet. His arrogance was evident in every gesture, every word. He regarded her as if she were just an inexperienced, perhaps even inconsequential young woman, speaking to her as if she were a child, a delinquent. The bailiff, Robert Hayes, an older man with kind eyes and a weathered face, watched the scene unfold with a hint of unease. In his 15 years there, he'd seen Grayson treat those who didn't fit his mold, his narrow definition of respectability, differently. "Your Honor, may I explain?" Karoline began, her voice steady and professional, a stark contrast to the judge's rising agitation. "You may not," Grayson cut her off, his tone firm, almost brutal, as if to squash any resistance, any attempt at explanation. Judge Edward Grayson interrupted Karoline. "I've heard every excuse in the book. Car trouble, traffic, personal emergencies. None of that matters here. The session was set to start on time," he said, lifting his gavel as if its mere presence underscored his absolute authority. Those, awaiting their cases, watched intently, a mixture of apprehension and morbid curiosity on their faces. A young woman in a business suit who'd arrived a few minutes before Karoline sat silently, her own tardiness completely, conveniently overlooked. A pattern of unfairness, of blatant bias, was becoming apparent to everyone in the courtroom. Everyone, it seemed, except Grayson himself, blinded by his own sense of self-importance. "This court will not tolerate such disregard for procedure," Grayson continued, his face flushing slightly. Not with shame, but with indignation, as his authority was challenged by Karoline's unwavering composure. "Perhaps a fine will remind you of the importance of punctuality." The tension in the courtroom thickened, palpable, almost suffocating. Other defendants watched with a mix of empathy and concern, a silent understanding passing between them. The court clerk, Mrs. Margaret Evans, a middle-aged woman who'd worked with Grayson for years, grew increasingly uneasy as she typed the proceedings into her computer, her fingers hesitating over the keys. What Grayson didn't realize, as he prepared to pronounce his penalty, his judgment, was that his next words would set off a chain of events, challenging not just his authority, but revealing Karoline's unexpected, formidable prowess. The morning's real shock was still to come. Grayson leaned forward in his high-backed leather chair, his expression stern, almost menacing, as he prepared to deliver his ruling. Morning sunlight streamed through the courtroom's tall windows, casting harsh shadows across his face, enhancing his imposing demeanor. "Miss Leavitt," he declared, his voice echoing through the now silent room, "this court hereby fines you $500 for contempt." He paused, letting the amount sink in, a deliberate act of intimidation. It was one of the steepest fines he'd issued for lateness, though he conveniently failed to mention that fact. Karoline stood motionless at the podium, her mind swiftly, silently cataloging every detail of this exchange. She noticed how Grayson's eyes never quite met hers, how his tone carried an edge she'd encountered far too often in her political career, a blend of arrogance and prejudice, specifically targeted at her youth, her perceived inexperience. From her time with Trump, she'd honed a knack for spotting self-importance, ego, disguised as authority. Mrs. Margaret Evans entered the fine into the system with hesitant fingers. In her 12 years there, she'd felt uneasy before, but this felt different. She felt compelled to jot a private note about this in her log, a small act of rebellion. Just the previous week, a middle-aged attorney had arrived 20 minutes late, without explanation, and received only a mild reprimand, a mere slap on the wrist. "Furthermore," Grayson went on, seemingly emboldened by Karoline's silence, "let this serve as a lesson in responsibility." He lifted a sheet of paper, pretending to read, though it was clearly for show, a theatrical flourish. "The legal system runs on order and respect. Without punctuality, we'd have chaos." Among the onlookers, reactions varied. The young woman in the suit checked her watch, recalling her own unnoticed delay, a knot of guilt forming in her stomach. An elderly local shook his head slightly, sadly, all too familiar with Grayson's treatment of those outside his narrow, rigid standards. Bailiff Robert Hayes maintained his professional stance near the judge's bench, but his jaw tightened noticeably, a subtle sign of his disapproval. In 15 years, he'd quietly noted countless such injustices, though he'd never spoken up, never dared to challenge the judge's authority. Karoline took a slow, deliberate breath. She'd faced far tougher situations, far more intimidating adversaries. From fielding sharp, often hostile questions in White House press rooms to defending Trump against fierce political criticism. But this was different. It was personal, yet it stood for something greater than herself, a principle, a fundamental belief in fairness. She carefully pulled out her phone and noted the fine's amount and details, a meticulous record of the judge's actions. Additionally, Judge Edward Grayson continued, his tone growing stricter, almost like a disciplinarian scolding a wayward child. "You'll pay this fine before leaving the courthouse today. We wouldn't want you late on that too, would we?" A few nervous chuckles rose from the gallery, quickly stifled by the tense, oppressive atmosphere. The morning sun had shifted, now illuminating Karoline's face as she stood at the podium. She remained professional, outwardly calm, but her eyes held a steely resolve, a quiet determination that a shrewder judge, a more perceptive observer, might have hesitated to confront. She'd spent years sharpening her mind, honing her intellect through late nights studying legal documents with Trump's advisors, gathering insights, preparing for any scenario, any challenge. Now, unwittingly, Grayson was handing her every tool, every weapon she needed to expose the blatant bias in his courtroom. "Do you understand the fine as I've explained it?" Grayson asked, his tone implying he expected meek compliance, a submissive acceptance of his judgment. When Karoline finally spoke, her voice was clear, measured and utterly devoid of fear. "Yes, Your Honor. I understand. Completely," she replied, each word carefully chosen, her tone betraying none of the calculations, the strategic thinking, swirling within her mind. She'd learned long ago that sometimes the strongest response, the most powerful weapon, was to document everything, to observe, to wait for the right moment, the opportune time to strike. Grayson nodded, satisfied, smug even, with what he took as submission, as acquiescence to his authority. He reached for the next case file, ready to move on, as if he hadn't just displayed the very bias, the very prejudice, that tarnished the legal system he was sworn to uphold. He didn't notice Karoline's meticulous recording of his words, his tone, his disparate treatment of defendants. He didn't see her quickly type a short, coded message to her White House team, oblivious that his fleeting moments of presumed authority were about to become evidence in a broader, more significant fight for justice. The courtroom remained taut, expectant, as Grayson prepared to proceed. But Karoline wasn't done. In fact, she was just beginning. The next few minutes would shake the foundations of the tightly controlled world Grayson had so carefully built, and he didn't see it coming. Not at all. The moment Karoline opened her briefcase, the courtroom's atmosphere shifted, subtly but perceptibly. She pulled out a leather-bound notebook, the one where she'd kept meticulous legal notes from countless Trump campaign meetings, the morning light catching the densely written pages, a testament to her dedication and diligence. Grayson had already turned his focus to the next case, assuming their exchange was over, finished. He was mistaken, profoundly mistaken. "Your Honor!" Karoline's voice rang out, clear and strong, imbued with a newfound authority, halting everyone in the room. "Before we proceed, I need to clarify something, for the record." She held up her notebook, its detailed legal precedents, gleaned from her late-night studies, plain to see. "I am Karoline Leavitt, White House Press Secretary, and though I'm not here as a lawyer, I have enough legal knowledge to contest this court's ruling." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Grayson's face, flushed with the arrogance of unchecked authority moments earlier, drained of color. His hand, reaching for the next file, froze mid-air. The room fell so silent that the old ceiling fan's gentle hum suddenly seemed loud, intrusive. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, stopped typing mid-sentence, her fingers hovering over the keyboard, suspended in time. Bailiff Robert Hayes couldn't hide a subtle, almost imperceptible smile. In his 15 years, he'd seen much in this courtroom, much that had troubled him. But this moment would stick with him forever. A quiet victory, a long overdue challenge. Grayson started, then faltered, his voice losing its characteristic bluster. For the first time that morning, he truly looked at Karoline, not just at her youth or her political role, but at her professional demeanor, her impeccable blazer, and, most crucially, the quiet, unwavering confidence in her legal acumen. "I apologize for my delay this morning," Karoline Leavitt continued, her voice steady and clear, cutting through the stunned silence. "I was delayed by an urgent matter from the White House regarding the Gulf of America's decree, which I'm sure Your Honor has heard about in the news," she said, pausing briefly to let her words sink in, to allow the weight of her position to register. "I have an email confirmation from political advisor Michael Reynolds, and I'm happy to provide it to the court, if needed." The young woman in the suit, who'd arrived late earlier, sank lower in her seat, feeling as if she were watching a movie unfold, a surreal drama playing out before her very eyes. An elderly local in the gallery sat up straighter, pride flashing in his eyes. This was a rare sight, a moment of defiance in his lifetime. Judge Edward Grayson's mouth opened and closed several times, like a fish out of water, before he finally found his voice. Miss Leavitt, He fumbled with papers on his desk, looking diminished, almost shrunken in his elevated chair. "If I'd known your role—" "My role shouldn't matter, Your Honor," Karoline interjected, firm yet respectful, her voice carrying the weight of principle. "What matters is fairness in applying the law." She placed her notebook on the podium and pulled out her phone, a small, powerful device in her hand. "I've noted several concerning points from this morning's proceedings, including the unequal treatment of defendants based on their age and reputation." Grayson's face shifted from pale to faintly green. As a municipal judge, he knew a figure like Karoline, with her sharp intellect, her meticulous preparation, and her White House ties, could spell serious trouble, career-ending trouble. His mind raced, re-examining the morning through a new, horrifying lens. "Perhaps," he said hastily, his voice lacking its usual conviction, "we could discuss this in chambers. And, of course, the fine is dismissed." "No, Your Honor," Karoline replied, her voice carrying the weight of every time she'd faced dismissal, every time she'd been underestimated in her career. "Dismissing the fine just because of who I am would only reinforce the bias I'm addressing. Instead, I believe this is a chance for a broader conversation about fairness in the law." The other defendants watched in awe, many clutching their phones, despite the courtroom rules against recording. This was a moment they'd recount to their children, their grandchildren. The day a young woman stood up to challenge the biases they'd felt, they'd experienced, but rarely, if ever, proved. Mrs. Margaret Evans typed faster than ever, her fingers flying across the keyboard, determined to capture every word, every nuance of this historic exchange. She'd seen Grayson berate, belittle countless defendants over the years, but never had she witnessed such a powerful, precise, and utterly justified challenge to his authority. The morning sun now flooded the courtroom, lighting the scene like a stage under a spotlight. Grayson sat in his chair, his authority crumbling, dissolving before him, while Karoline stood tall at the podium, transforming from a defendant into a symbol, an icon of exceptional intellect, of unwavering courage, before everyone's eyes. The next words in this courtroom would lay the groundwork for a shift, a seismic shift, far beyond Pinton's small court. A personal victory, yes, but more importantly, a moment illuminating Karoline's brilliance, her unwavering commitment to justice. The minor contract dispute had become something far, far greater, A moment of strength, of defiance, that no one could ignore. The fallout from Karoline Leavitt's defiance rippled through Grayson's courtroom like a slow-motion earthquake. His immediate backpedaling was obvious, embarrassingly so to all. He shuffled papers, cleared his throat repeatedly, and adjusted his glasses. Clear, unmistakable signs of mounting unease, of panic even. "Miss Leavitt," Grayson said, his voice noticeably softer, almost meek compared to his earlier bluster. "Allow me to be the first to apologize for this unfortunate misunderstanding." He pressed a button to summon his clerk, a desperate attempt to regain some semblance of control. "We'll strike this fine from the record, at once." Karoline remained at the podium, her stance upright and professional, a picture of unwavering resolve. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice firm yet measured, "I respectfully decline to have the fine dismissed." Her words sparked murmurs, gasps of surprise, throughout the courtroom. "Instead," Karoline Leavitt continued, her voice gaining strength, "I'd like to address the larger issue at hand." The other defendants leaned forward, riveted, their attention completely focused on her. Mrs. Margaret Evans, the clerk, stopped typing entirely, her fingers frozen above the keyboard, as she watched the scene unfold, mesmerized. Bailiff Robert Hayes edged closer to the courtroom center, sensing the historic weight, the profound significance of the moment. "This morning," Karoline went on, pulling out her phone, where she'd taken meticulous notes, "I observed 7 people enter this courtroom after the session began. Of those, 3 were middle-aged professionals who received no comment, no reprimand from the bench." She paused, letting the facts, the stark reality of the situation, settle. 2 were young students who got verbal warnings, and 2, including myself, faced the harshest treatment, likely due to our youth or reputation. Judge Edward Grayson's face reddened again, this time from embarrassment, shame rather than authority. "Miss Leavitt, what you're saying amounts to very serious accusations." His voice wavered slightly, his confidence shattered. "I assure you, this court treats everyone equally." "The evidence suggests otherwise, Your Honor," Karoline replied calmly, her voice devoid of malice, simply stating the facts. She turned slightly to address the whole room, her gaze sweeping across the faces of the other defendants, the spectators. "In fact, I've already sent a detailed note about this to my team at the White House. As someone working in the administration, I have a duty to point out any biased behavior in our legal system." A young law student, seated at the back, scribbled furiously in his notebook. This was the kind of real-world legal drama, the kind of raw, unfiltered justice no textbook could ever teach. The elderly local, who'd watched from the start, wiped a tear from his eye, recalling his own past experiences of unfair treatment, of feeling powerless in the face of injustice. "What exactly are you proposing?" Grayson asked, his confidence seeming to erode, to crumble, with each passing second. The morning sunlight through the windows now felt like an interrogating beam, focused solely on his face, exposing his vulnerability. Karoline placed both hands on the podium, her voice clear, resolute, and purposeful. "I propose 3 immediate actions, Your Honor. First, I'll pay the $500 fine, not because it's fair, but because it will serve as documented evidence of today's proceedings." She raised 2 fingers. "Second, I request that you review the past 6 months of contempt charges and fines issued in this courtroom, focusing on patterns and how defendants are treated." Grayson's face paled, his eyes widening in alarm as she went on. "And third, I suggest mandatory bias awareness training for all court personnel, including the bench." The courtroom was silent, utterly silent. But the air crackled with energy, with the palpable sense of change, of a shift in the balance of power. Mrs. Margaret Evans resumed typing, her fingers moving with renewed vigor, determined to record every word, every nuance of this extraordinary exchange. Robert Hayes nodded slightly, almost imperceptibly, a silent acknowledgement of the justice he'd longed to see for so long. He'd seen countless similar situations go unchallenged, ignored, over his years in the courtroom. "These proposals," Grayson began, attempting to regain some semblance of control, though his voice was weak, almost trembling. "Though well-intentioned, seem rather extreme for a simple case of tardiness." "With all due respect, Your Honor," Karoline responded, her voice unwavering. "What's extreme is the persistent pattern of bias in our courts. From my experience working with President Trump, I've seen how these small issues pile up, accumulate, into major barriers to justice." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a check, a tangible symbol of her commitment. "I'll pay the fine now, and my team will follow up regarding the court records," she said, her voice free of anger or resentment. Just the professional, determined tone of someone who knew how to challenge injustice, how to fight for fairness from within the system. The morning sun now filled the courtroom, illuminating every corner, every face. Grayson sat in his high-backed chair, but he no longer looked imposing, no longer commanded the room. The power dynamic had shifted irrevocably, and everyone present knew they were witnessing not just Karoline's personal triumph, but a moment affirming her exceptional talent, her unwavering dedication to justice. By late afternoon that day, the story of what happened in Grayson's courtroom spread like wildfire through New Hampshire's legal and political communities. It all started with a text, a simple, electrifying text from the young law student to her friends. "Just saw the White House press secretary take down a judge in court. Unbelievable." The young law student, who'd witnessed it all, texted her study group. "Just saw something incredible at Pinton Municipal Court. The White House press secretary humbled a judge with her legal skills. You won't believe it. It was Karoline Leavitt." Karoline Leavitt sat in her White House office, reviewing documents related to the Gulf of America decree, when her phone began buzzing nonstop. A relentless barrage of calls and messages. First came calls from political colleagues in New Hampshire. They wanted to share their own stories, their own experiences of facing Judge Edward Grayson. Many had stayed silent for years, fearing that speaking out would harm their careers, damage their reputations. "This isn't just about me," Karoline told her colleague, David Parker, a Trump campaign advisor, as he stopped by her office for a quick update. "For every young person like me treated this way. Imagine how many regular folks suffer quietly, feeling powerless." She showed him the growing list of messages, a torrent of emails, texts, and social media posts, from politicians and journalists across the state, all sharing similar stories of bias and unfair treatment. Meanwhile, in the Pinton Courthouse break room, Mrs. Margaret Evans, the court clerk, chatted with other staff, a newfound boldness in her voice. "I've been keeping my own records," she admitted, pulling a small, worn notebook from her desk drawer. "Every time I saw something off, I wrote it down. Dates, names, fines, everything." Her hands trembled slightly, a mixture of nerves and excitement, as she shared the information she'd kept secret, buried for years. By early evening, local news stations picked up the story, the ripples of Karoline's actions spreading outwards. Reporter Jonathan Lee from Channel 7 News stood outside the courthouse, his crew setting up for the evening broadcast. Sources inside the courthouse confirmed the White House press secretary was fined $500 for arriving late this morning, he reported, his voice grave. But what happened next has sparked a statewide debate about bias in our legal system. The story quickly spread to social media, exploding across platforms. Hashtags like #HadGrayson and #LegalGenius trended in New Hampshire. People shared their own experiences with Grayson, their own encounters with his perceived bias, and a clear, undeniable pattern emerged. Former defendants posted about harsh treatment in his courtroom, often tied to their youth, their appearance, or their perceived social standing. That evening, Grayson sat at home, watching the news with growing dread, a knot of anxiety tightening in his stomach. His phone had been ringing all afternoon, calls from fellow judges, from the State Judicial Board, from reporters seeking comment, demanding answers. He'd served on the bench for 30 years. And now, in a single day, his entire career, his reputation, was under scrutiny, threatened with unraveling. Karoline's office phone rang again. This time, it was Emily Carter, a prominent New Hampshire journalist, her voice filled with urgency and excitement. "We've been trying to document these biases for years," Emily said. "But coming from someone like you, the White House press secretary, who experienced it firsthand, this changes everything. Would you be willing to speak at a press conference tomorrow? At the Pinton Municipal Court?" Pinton Municipal Court's filing office staff were already pulling Grayson's old case records, their hands moving quickly, efficiently. They whispered among themselves as they noticed patterns, disturbing patterns, in his fines and rulings. One clerk found that, over the past year, younger defendants were 3 times more likely to receive maximum fines in his courtroom than older ones, for the same violations. By nightfall, national news outlets took notice. "New Hampshire judge faces scrutiny after fining White House press secretary," one headline read. "Unexpected legal talent shines in New Hampshire courtroom," another announced. Social media erupted with discussions about age bias, about systemic prejudice in the legal system, with Karoline's experience serving as a prime example, a catalyst for change. Robert Hayes, the bailiff, got several calls from colleagues that night, their voices filled with a mixture of disbelief and cautious optimism. "We've all seen things like this," he told them. "This time, someone with influence saw it too, and she didn't let it slide." He recalled the countless times he'd watched similar scenes unfold, feeling powerless to act, to intervene. Late that night, Karoline sat in her home office, sifting through the hundreds, the thousands, of messages she'd received. Political organizations invited her to speak at events, to share her story. Media groups asked Karoline Leavitt to help document similar cases of bias, of injustice. Law schools invited her to guest lecture on confronting systemic bias, on fighting for fairness within the legal system. She opened her laptop and began drafting a formal report to the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee. This was no longer just about one judge, one incident, one courtroom. It had grown into something much bigger, something far more significant, a catalyst for change, for reform, in a system desperately needing it. As she worked, her phone buzzed with another message. It was from the young law student. "Thank you," the message read, "for showing us we can change the system from within. You've given us hope." A week after the incident, the New Hampshire Judicial Conduct Committee launched a formal investigation into Judge Edward Grayson's conduct. The large conference room on the 10th floor of the State Justice Building buzzed with activity, a hive of focused energy, as investigators pored over thousands of court records from the past 5 years. Laura Bennett, the lead investigator, with 20 years of experience, spread dozens of files across the long, wooden table. Her team worked tirelessly, meticulously, analyzing every case Grayson had handled, searching for patterns, for evidence of bias. The patterns they uncovered were undeniable, shocking in their clarity. "Look at these numbers," Laura told her team, pointing to a spreadsheet on her laptop, her voice filled with a mixture of professional outrage and grim satisfaction. In minor contract disputes, defendants under 30 were fined an average of $400, while older defendants paid $120 for the same issues. She pushed her glasses up, a weary sigh escaping her lips. And that's just the start. A few steps away, in a small, sterile interview room, Mrs. Margaret Evans sat nervously, her worn notebook clutched tightly in her hands. For 12 years, she had documented every troubling incident, every instance of perceived bias she'd seen in Grayson's courtroom. Now, finally, she had the chance to share them, to speak truth to power. "I noticed the pattern. My first year as his clerk," she told the investigators, her hands trembling slightly as she opened her notebook, revealing its meticulously kept secrets. The way he spoke to people varied. His tone, his words, even the time he gave them to explain. It all depended on their age, their appearance, their role. The investigation expanded beyond fines, beyond the simple numbers. The team interviewed dozens of former defendants, lawyers, and court staff. Robert Hayes, the bailiff, provided a handwritten statement detailing hundreds of incidents he'd observed over his 15 years. A damning indictment of Grayson's conduct. Some days, I'd count how often the judge interrupted younger defendants compared to older ones, he wrote, his words filled with a quiet, simmering anger. The difference was staggering. Young defendants were interrupted 5 times more on average. Meanwhile, at the White House, Karoline continued her routine work, preparing media responses for Trump, navigating the turbulent waters of political communication. But her office became a hub, a sanctuary, for people wanting to share their stories, their experiences of injustice. Young advisors brought records of their own encounters with bias. Community activists provided documentation of long-ignored complaints, a chorus of voices rising in unison. "We need to organize all this information," Karoline told her assistant, eyeing the growing pile of evidence on her desk, a mountain of accumulated grievances. Every story matters. Every incident counts. This isn't just about one judge, it's about reshaping how we view justice, how we achieve justice. The investigation team uncovered more troubling patterns, each discovery more damning than the last. Young women received the highest fines, on average. Cases involving defendants under 35 were processed 40% faster than those with older individuals. Requests for payment plans were denied 3 times more often for younger people. Witnesses defending young defendants were interrupted more frequently, their voices silenced, their testimonies dismissed. Grayson was summoned for questioning multiple times. Each session revealed more about his unconscious biases, his deeply ingrained prejudices. When confronted with the data, the stark, undeniable evidence of his discriminatory behavior, he seemed genuinely shocked, apparently never having realized the extent, the sheer magnitude of his prejudice. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he said in one interview, his voice quieter, almost subdued compared to his usual courtroom demeanor. I didn't realize." For the first time, he seemed to grasp the impact, the real-world consequences of his actions, his words, his rulings. The investigation also revealed that several other judges in the area showed similar patterns, disturbing patterns in their rulings. What began as a probe into one judge's conduct had exposed a systemic issue, a rot within the system, far beyond Pinton's courtroom. By the end of the 3rd week, Laura Bennett and her team completed a comprehensive report. The 300-page document was packed with statistics, testimonies, and detailed analysis of thousands of cases, a mountain of irrefutable evidence. The evidence was overwhelming, damning. "This report doesn't just highlight isolated incidents," Laura explained to the committee board, placing the hefty document on the conference table, her voice filled with a mixture of professional satisfaction and a profound sense of responsibility. "It reveals a systemic bias pattern that's affected thousands of lives over years. More importantly, it shows how this bias operates so quietly, so insidiously, that even those perpetuating it might not fully recognize their actions." As the investigation neared its end, one thing became crystal clear. Karoline Leavitt's experience, her courageous stand, had pried open a door sealed shut for decades. Behind it lay years, decades of recorded bias, discrimination, and inequity, waiting to be exposed, to be addressed. The question now wasn't just about Grayson's fate, his punishment. It was about how to fix a system, a deeply flawed system, that had allowed such bias to thrive, unchecked, for so long. The next steps demanded more than discipline, more than a slap on the wrist. They required a complete reimagining, a fundamental restructuring of how justice was served in New Hampshire's courts. 3 months after Karoline Leavitt stepped into Grayson's courtroom, the face of justice in Pinton began to shift, to transform. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of the main courthouse, now renovated, revitalized. as workers installed a new sign, Center for Judicial Training and Fairness. A powerful statement, a symbol of change. Grayson no longer sat on the bench. After the investigation's findings, he was given a choice: resign or face a public hearing, a public reckoning. He chose resignation, a quiet, almost ignominious end to his career. But that wasn't the end of his story. In an unexpected twist, a twist of fate and perhaps of redemption, he became part of the solution. "I never saw my own bias," Grayson told a group of judges at the first mandatory training session. His voice humbled, his posture less rigid, less arrogant than the man who'd fined Karoline. He stood at the podium, a different man, a changed man. "I thought fairness meant treating everyone the same, but I never examined how my background, my assumptions, my unconscious biases shape my rulings." Karoline sat at the back of the training room, watching the scene unfold, a quiet observer. She hadn't anticipated this outcome, this unexpected turn of events, when she stood up in that courtroom 3 months earlier. Beside her sat Mrs. Margaret Evans, now promoted to head a new court monitoring program. A powerful position, a testament to her courage and her meticulous record-keeping. The changes rippled beyond one courthouse, beyond Pinton. New rules mandated detailed records of fines, rulings, and judicial conduct, to be reviewed monthly by an independent committee of community members, legal experts, and activists. A system of checks and balances, of accountability. Robert Hayes, the bailiff, was appointed to lead a new training program for court staff. His years of silent observation now transformed into a powerful tool for change. "We're the eyes and ears of the courtroom," he told his first class of trainees, his voice filled with passion and conviction. "It's our duty to speak up when we see unfairness. The days of staying silent are over." At the White House, Karoline looked at the wall where she'd framed her $500 fine receipt. It had become a symbol, a powerful reminder of change, reminding visitors that one person's stand, one act of courage, could make a difference, a profound difference. Below it hung a new photo of her with a group of law students. She now taught a weekly class on ethics and bias in the legal system, sharing her experience, her knowledge, with the next generation of legal minds. The local bar association established a new reporting system for documenting bias incidents. In its first month, it received over 200 reports, each thoroughly investigated, painting a clear, detailed picture of existing issues, and more importantly, potential solutions. "It's not just about punishing wrongdoing," Karoline Leavitt explained to a reporter during an interview, her voice calm and resolute. "It's about changing how we think about justice. Everyone who walks into a courtroom deserves respect, deserves fairness, regardless of age, gender, or role." The changes weren't confined to Pinton. Other New Hampshire cities adopted similar reforms: mandatory bias awareness training for court staff, regular audits of rulings for fairness, community oversight committees to monitor court practices, and new guidelines to standardize fines and rulings. Law schools, inspired by Karoline's actions, also mandated diversity and inclusion training for students. One morning, 3 months after the incident, Karoline received a letter. It was from the young law student who'd seen it all that day in court, the student who'd texted her friends about Karoline's legal genius. The student wrote that the moment had altered her career path, her entire trajectory. She now focused on social justice law, determined to fight for the underdog, to challenge systemic bias. "You showed me change is possible," the letter read. "Sometimes it just takes one person, willing to stand up and say, 'This isn't right.'" She'd started a legal clinic at her law school to aid those facing court discrimination, a direct result of Karoline's inspiring stand. The elderly local from that day, the man who'd witnessed so much injustice in his lifetime, returned to visit the courthouse. He walked slowly through the halls, noting the changes, the tangible signs of progress. Multilingual signs welcoming visitors, a help desk offering free legal guidance, and security personnel greeting everyone equally, with respect. "I have been coming here for 40 years, he told a young clerk at the desk. his eyes welling up with tears, tears of gratitude, of hope. "This is the first time I felt justice might truly be fair." Karoline's phone buzzed with a message. The Judicial Review Board wanted her to lead a new commission on court reform, a testament to her impact, her influence. As she read it, she recalled that morning, 3 months ago, a seemingly insignificant day, a minor court appearance, a small act of standing up for what was right, of challenging injustice, had sparked a wave of change, a ripple effect that was still growing, still spreading. In the Pynton Courthouse's main lobby, a new plaque was installed, a permanent reminder of the transformative power of one person's courage. It read, "Justice isn't just about the law. It's about how we treat each person who walks through these doors." Below was the date. Karoline Leavitt entered Edward Grayson's courtroom and changed everything. Karoline Leavitt's story isn't just a dramatic courtroom tale. It's a blueprint for how ordinary individuals, armed with courage and knowledge, can challenge systemic bias and spark real change. Her experience in Judge Grayson's courtroom highlights a crucial point. Justice isn't an abstract concept. It's a lived experience, shaped by the interactions between individuals and the institutions designed to uphold it. The key takeaways from Karoline's story are: knowledge is a power. Karoline's self-taught legal knowledge, gleaned from her work with the Trump campaign, wasn't just impressive, it was essential. She used it not to attack, but to expose a pattern of unfairness. This underscores the importance of educating ourselves, of understanding our rights and the workings of the legal system. Documentation is crucial. Karoline meticulously documented everything: Grayson's words, his tone, the discrepancies in his treatment of defendants. This provided concrete evidence to support her claims, transforming a he said, she said situation into an undeniable case of bias. Courage to speak up. Perhaps the most important lesson is the power of speaking up. Karoline didn't hesitate to challenge a judge, a figure of authority, because she knew she was right. Her courage inspired others, the court clerk, the bailiff, the other defendants, to find their own voices. Systemic change requires collective action. Karoline's actions didn't stop with her own case. She used her platform, her influence, to advocate for broader reforms, leading to training, oversight committees, and new reporting systems. This highlights the need for systemic change, not just individual accountability. Bias can be unconscious. Grayson's eventual realization of his own bias is a crucial reminder that prejudice isn't always intentional. It can be deeply ingrained, operating unconsciously, influencing our decisions without our awareness. This underscores the need for ongoing education and self-reflection. Karoline Leavitt's story is a call to action. It's a reminder that we all have a role to play in ensuring fairness and justice. We don't need to be lawyers or politicians to make a difference. We just need to be observant, informed, and courageous enough to speak up when we see something wrong. What are your thoughts? Have you ever witnessed or experienced bias in a legal setting or any other institution? Share your experiences and ideas for promoting fairness in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to this channel for more inspiring stories of justice and unexpected brilliance.